Yeah, when the first parliamentary elections after the Egyptian uprising of 2011, the first parliamentary elections took place in the fall of, well, approximately 1 year ago, and the result, as probably all of you know, was that the Islamists came to dominate the National Assembly. First of all, the Muslim Brothers, who got about around 40% of the vote, but due to the system of assigning seats in the parliament, they got about 48% of the seats. That perhaps was not a big surprise. What was more of a surprise, at least to people who didn't know Egypt too well, maybe even to Egyptians themselves, and maybe even to the salafis themselves, was the strong showing of the newly formed salafi political parties. And I'll come back to that, but they got about one quarter of the seats. So they, together with the Muslim Brothers, made up about how much is that? Almost 3/4 of the parliament. What I'll be focusing on today, it's not a general assessment of the Salafis, nor of the role of the Salafis in Egyptian politics. It's a more narrow topic. We can certainly discuss that, but it's a more narrow topic. Is what is the effect when the Salafis, who had traditionally remained outside of politics, when they enter politics, even competitive politics, how does it affect them? Because it does affect them. It has to. That it was a new experience and maybe a quite straining experience. You can perhaps gauge from this photo, which is from one of the sessions in Parliament. And I wanted also to start up to show you a small video from YouTube from an incident that took part very early on in this Parliament. And what you'll see is the two actors in question is one. This is from, I think, early February 2011, one of the early sessions in Parliament, where one deputy, Mamdouh Ismail, representing the smallest of the three Salafi groupings, Hizb al-Asala, took it upon himself in the middle of a session in Parliament to call for to sound the call for prayer. And the other actor in the scene is Saad al-Qatatni, the Speaker of Parliament, who is, of course, a prominent member of the Muslim Brothers. So I'll just, this thing is from, this thing is from Memory, which an organization that translate and publish a lot of things that happen in the Arab world, which is worth a discussion in itself, but this is not the topic now. Let me see. Whatever this is an indication, at least, that maybe symbolizes even that the move from the mosque to the hall of the Parliament, and where they meet another type of Islamists who have sort of acknowledged this, that this is not, as Qatatni said, this is not the mosque. This is a hall for discussion. So it was a challenge for the Salafis to enter Parliament, and of course, the entering of competitive politics to the Salafis may influence them in several ways. One aspect might be that it's because they are competing, as I will come back to, with other groups who claim to represent true Islam. So there is a competition to be more Islamist than you. I mean, to present oneself as the most true to Islamic principles, and that might influence, of course, the Salafis even in a conservative direction. We might discuss that, but I won't dwell on this, but what I will more dwell on is that there is another effect which is perhaps in the opposite direction, because when they move exactly from the prayer hall or from the mosque to politics, they move in a sense from the world of lofty principles and doctrine to the more messy world of having to deal with, or appearing to deal with, real economic problems, social problems, and so on. So, and this is certainly not a finished analysis either, but it's some reflections. First, just to, as I stated very briefly, the salafis, when they ran in this election, they won about 28% of the votes, I think about 24% of the seats, and that was, they ran in a bloc called the Islamic Alliance, but known generally as a Salafi Alliance, with three main parties: Hizb al-Nur, which we see got 107. I mean, the Salafis altogether here got, according to this count, got 123 seats, but 107 of them went to the biggest one, Hizb al-Nur, which is based on an organization called Al-Dawa al-Salafiyya, the Salafi Call, which has been an organization for preacher and to an extent for social work, based mostly in Alexandria. The second, Hizb al-Bina wal-Tanmiya, got 13 seats, which means the party, Hizb al-Nur of course meaning the party of light, and the second meaning the party of building or construction and development, which is based in an organization called Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyya. And finally a small party called Hizb al-Asala, the Authenticity Party, 3 seats. One thing to notice perhaps is that both the Hizb al-Nur and the Hizb al-Bina wal-Tanmiya originate, we might say, in the big Islamist student movement from the 1970s, which really represented the reawakening of the Islamist movement in Egypt after the Muslim Brothers had been crushed under Nasser's rule in the 50s and the 60s. Then this new student movement in the 70s breathed new life into it, and is sort of, and the leadership of these movements still from the student generation. And both the Hizb al-Nur and the Hizb al-Bina wal-Tanmiya spring from that student generation. Hizb al-Nur from that part of the student movement that decided to stay out of politics and continue sort of pious work for reawakening the true Muslim spirit in the Egyptian population. The Hizb al-Bina wal-Tanmiya, interestingly, comes from the Jama'ah Islamiyya, which is that part of the student movement that chose rose to an armed jihad against the Egyptian authorities, and were involved in a small-scale guerrilla war against the security forces, but also in acts of terrorism against tourists, against ministers, against Christians. But who, since 1997, have chosen, opted out of this armed struggle. And interestingly, the Muslim Brothers, who I'm not going to talk about, but the mainstay of the Muslim Brothers today is the third part of that student movement, a part that chose political work, I mean peaceful political work. Finally, we should also mention another factor among the Salafis in Egypt, among those Salafis that entered politics, which is Hazem Abu Ismail, who is not, until now, has not been member of a particular party, but who ran as a presidential candidate, or wanted to run as a presidential candidate in the elections this last spring, and who, for one period, ran about got about almost 30% in opinion polls before he was disqualified because his mother had an American passport. But who is still active, and who, more than these other parties, have been active in the on the street, as it were, from very early on in the revolution. Because it is a factor that when it comes to the even if one read works on Salafism and definitions of Salafism, often it is mentioned that to be a Salafi is to stay away from politics. And certainly the Dawah Salafiyya, the largest Salafi movement in Egypt, had as part of its doctrine to stay away from politics. And the idea, which is common in official Wahhabi Islam, the official doctrine in Saudi Arabia, the idea that the political duty of an ordinary Muslim is to be obedient to the Wali al-Amr, to the person that is set to rule. So early on when the revolution started in January of last year, many Salafis stayed away from the demonstrations because they saw them as a rebellion against the Wali al-Amr, even if they didn't like Mubarak, even if Mubarak was not a good Muslim, but he was the Wali al-Amr, and the duty was to be obedient. So they were, as it were, only latecomers to the revolutionary movement. Hazm Abu Ismail as an exception from that, and to an extent also this smaller party, Hezbollah bin Abu Tanmiya. A few words more about Salafi Islam. It's a huge and complicated topic to talk about what is Salafi Islam, but of course the word comes from the term al-salaf al-salih, the good or the righteous forefathers or ancestors, which is a reference to the early generations of Muslims, the generation of the Prophet, and in most versions of this, generation of the Prophet and the two following generations. And an idea that the only authoritative interpretation or the only authority in interpreting Islam, telling us what is true Islam, is of course the Quran, the Word of God, and the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet. But otherwise, if we are looking for authoritative interpretations, we have to look to those early Muslims, because they were so close to the Prophet and knew the ways of the Prophet. And anything that, in the strict Salafi version, anything that's any new ideas that came later that cannot be attested that it was practice or doctrine in this early generation is a bid'ah, is an impious innovation which should be shunned. And also, the Salafis typically see as a central duty al-amr bil ma'ruf wal nahy anil munkar, commanding good and preventing evil. That for the good Muslim should act to sort of enforce the will of God in society. But again, since the typical Salafis have stayed away from politics, so this has been interpreted as the scope for this kind of activism has typically been interpreted as having to do with personal behavior, and clothing, the question of hijab for women, the avoidance of alcohol, issues of avoiding mixing between men and women, undue mixing between unrelated men and women, and so on. I took this because it's an illustration. This is a call for the use of the siwak if you want to brush your teeth, clean your teeth. And this is a strongly Salafi. This is like a symbolic thing for the Salafis, at least the strict Salafis, that you shouldn't use a toothbrush, because toothbrush is an innovation. You should look for what did the Prophet do when he wanted to clean his teeth. Yes, he used the siwak, which is a twig of the arak tree, and you can see it's just made of brush here at the end. It says here that they quote the Prophet, and who said that this is cleansing for the mouth and pleasing to Allah. And this is quoted from Bukhari, one of the most prestigious collections of hadith of the Prophet. I took this also because it may illustrate also how the way salafis differ. Because if you want to, as the Swedish Islamologist Jan Hjerpe has pointed out, you can show the variation of interpretations of Islam by this example, because the Salafis would say, to be a good Muslim, you have to use this. Other Islamists, even like typical the Muslim Brothers, you would find a variation of takes on this, but certainly they might say that this shows us that the knowledge that the Prophet used this shows us that he was cared about the hygiene of the mouth and used the best available tool at his time. We have to use what is best in our time, toothpaste and toothbrush and so on. Have to see the dentist, or even on a broader scale. This is one of many examples that the Prophet and God sent the message through the Prophet that we as humans have to take care of our body, and so Muslims should take care of their body and keep in good health, and a Muslim state should also work to prevent disease and so on. So now, and maybe one last thing here. As for politics, one might say that if we say that the Salafi idea is that Islam has a doctrine, contains a message. This message was clear, or the purest version of this is what we can see from from the Quran, but also from this generation of the Salaf al-Salih. And in this, there is no compromise. This cannot be negotiated. What we know about the true Islam from these sources, they are the only authoritative sources we have, and they cannot be negotiated about. So, the attitude to politics, to simplify them, would typically then be either to avoid politics, because politics imply negotiation and dealing and compromise and so on, or otherwise to enter politics sword in hand, to enforce this thing which cannot be compromised about, which is what the Gamma Islamiyya did in its time, and what we know as the Salafi jihadi movements do. So now, but still, then after the Egyptian revolution, a significant portion of the Salafi movement in Egypt decided to change, in the sense that they decided to enter politics. And it's interesting then to look at what happened. What do we see when you look at them? And these are just some glimpses. And one of them is that if we look at the political program to take the largest party, the Hizb al-Nur, the clearly dominant party among the Salafis in Egypt. If we look at the political program which they presented, it is a typical Ikhwan here stands for the brothers, meaning the Muslim brothers. And when I say an Ikhwani program, is that because the Muslim brothers have a long history of entering into politics and creating political programs, starting in the at least early 1940s, on economic aspects of development and social issues, on program of what kind of political system they would like to see, and so on, which has typically been criticized by the Salafis for being for not taking care to present the pure Islamic version, for borrowing from the West and so on. So now, when the Hizb al-Nur made a political program, it is in many ways a rather Ikhwani program. On the issue of political system, they say that they want to rule by the people, and we know perhaps that many Salafis over time have been quoting as saying that democracy is blasphemy or is against God, because democracy involves people making the laws, where well, that is really a privilege for God. But here they talk about rule by the people. They explicitly condemn clerical rule, which is easy for the salafis, because one aspect salafis do in one sense, because it implies condemning Iran. And one aspect of Salafism, which I didn't touch on, is that their enmity towards, animosity towards anything to do with what they see as the worship of saints, and that this is where they would put that's one of the reasons why they would hate the Shia, because the Shia, of course, see the Imams as saint-like figures. But they condemn the political system in Iran, which is ruled by the clerics. But also they extend that to the case of Egypt, while at the same time warning against secularism, and then they portray secularism as something as an ideology that want to cut off the political system in Egypt from the deeply held values of the people. They, of course, talk a lot about the need for economic development, for the development of education. They talk about, I should mention, when it's just a phrase, but still it's an interesting formulation. When they talk about the state, they say we need a contemporary state on a modern basis, which is interesting coming from the Salafis. And then about the position of women in the relation between women and men, they also sound quite Ikhwan-like, in the sense that they try to compromise between presenting a positive view of women's participation and women's education on the one hand, and on the other hand sticking to the idea of the Muslim family, which is a family where the male man is the head of the household. Which is certainly not, they certainly not come around to any feminist point of view, but they move from a strict Salafi point of view to a typical kind of compromise that the Muslim Brothers is trying to create. And they also call for campaigns against violence against women, and so they try to take up some issues. It should be mentioned here, of course, that when I say they move in the direction of Ikhwan, if we contrast, it was a clear contrast between especially Hizb al-Nur and the Muslim Brothers. The Muslim Brothers, like all the Egyptian parties, had rather few female candidates, but they had some female candidates that were active and speaking in public and so on. The Salafis had to have, because there was a rule that you had to have at least one female candidate on the list, and they had, but there were some instances that were, of course, subject for a lot of fun in the newspapers, that they would either when they had the posters, they would show the woman's name and the picture of her husband, or they would show no picture, or they would, and it was certainly not an active campaign by the by the females. But in the program, it was like that. Now. Also, it should be mentioned here that this party was a rapidly created party, and the program was made very fast, and it was not made. It was not really a process of discussion amongst the members of the Hizb al-Nur. It was rather that a group of the leaders went around to different people with Salafis and non-Salafis, people with insights into the economy, politics, education, and so on, and asked them to suggest what could be nice to put in a program. So whether the party as such is committed to this kind of program is another issue. Just wanted briefly to mention a couple of other issues. One is that what is mentioned there, a big question in Egypt, and still going on, is the question of whether Egypt should accept a loan from the International Monetary Fund to get over the immediate economic and financial crisis. And there are many aspects to this discussion. Of course, has to do with Egypt's independence, has to do with what kind of conditions the monetary fund will put on in terms of austerity. But for the Salafis, an immediate question is a question of, well, this is a loan that we have to pay interest on. And interest is traditionally, and certainly by the Salafis, been considered riba. And riba is something which is condemned explicitly in the Quran. And this prohibition of riba is a whole starting point from the idea of Islamic finance and Islamic banks, which make other systems to avoid this. The interesting thing here is that not only the Hizb al-Nur, but Yasser al-Burhami, who is the deputy head and perhaps a strong man of the Dawah Salafiyya, the preaching organization that is behind the Hizb al-Nur, came out at one point and said that, well, Egypt needs these loans, and you know, there's no riba here. And he said, when he was challenged on, he said, yeah, because it's only 1.5% interest we're going to pay here, and that is so low, it's not really riba. It's just paying the cost, the transaction cost for to the IMF. Later he retracted somewhat, but this is still an ongoing debate among the Salafis. And recently I had a chance to meet some Salafi MPs or former MPs when they were here in Oslo, and they said they focused on found another way. Instead of saying that it's not riba, one of them said, well, it's riba, but this loan is this is an absolute necessity for Egypt now because the financial situation is catastrophic. And then there's another thing that comes in, the question of darura, need. And in fiqh, in tradition of Islamic jurisprudence, there is sometimes you can set aside clear rulings, at least for a while, if it's needed to prevent that people die or, extreme problems. So it just goes to show that there is a principle, and then there's a real problem in the economy, and then there's a pressure. Can we really just stand up for the principle and see the economy go to hell, or should we, find ways of moving around it? And also, when I say who's the legitimate leader, that's because there was a struggle this fall where Yasser Burhami was certainly involved between, at least to an extent, this was between the old guard of the preachers, the leaders of the Dawah Salafiyya, and the politicians that run the Hizb al-Nur, where the current party president, Ahmad Abdel Ghafour, was challenged and was at one time deposed, and then he was not deposed, and there was a struggle inside the party. Point being here that this struggle, from both sides, the argument went alongside the sort of the legitimacy or the legality according to the democratic rules of the party, which again is moving from a Salafi. In the Salafi position, they never had any very clear ideas about this, but typically I would say it would be like the legitimacy would come spontaneously. The leader, someone would show himself as the good leader, as the most knowledgeable about Islam, as a strong leader, able to act, and so on. He would come into the leadership position. But this idea about legality and rules and appealing to democracy is a new thing. Also, the very fact of entering into this competitive political scene, in a sense, compromises the pure Salafi standpoint, because they are then of course, one might say that perhaps if the Salafis got the majority, then they would cancel democracy. But at least for the time being, entering this and accepting being a minority, a strong party, but a minority party in this competition, both in the elections and inside the parliament, in votes for and now in the Constitutional Assembly, it means accepting the legitimacy of other views, even socialists, even secularists. But even if we forget about the secularists and just think about the fact that in this election that took part, there were 7 or 8 parties that claimed to represent Islam. So now it's sort of a movement from one truth to 7 or 8 truths about Islam. There was an interesting episode also when they, for the presidential elections, the Hizb ut-Tahrir chose to support the rather liberal Islamist candidate Abdul Minim Abu Futuh. Now, this was very, it was, here we see him meeting the leaders of the Dawah Salafi and Alexander. This is Abu Futuh. Now this was in the end. Probably a lot of the members of the Hizb didn't vote for him after all because he was not palatable to them. But again, it shows up this having to deal with politics because okay, there's a candidate from the Muslim Brothers, but the Muslim Brothers are our competitors. We don't want to support them. We don't want them to take the. At the time, the Muslim Brothers were the leading party in the parliament, so we don't want them to have the president as well. So we're looking for another candidate. Okay, this guy at least he has a background in the Islamist movement, and although we don't like many of his views, so it's like it's entering into this unclean world of politics as well. Just briefly, I want to mention that if I say that this for the Egyptian Salafis, this was a new thing to enter into politics. But the struggle over the legitimacy of politics is not new to the Salafiyya as an international movement. At least it goes back some decades. One such struggle was between Nasr al-Din al-Albani, who was one of the major Salafi leaders for a time based in Saudi Arabia, although he's Syrian. Of course, he has an Albanian family background, but that's why it's called Albani, who was very strict Salafi, and especially strict that all that mattered, almost everything has to be based on the hadith of the Prophet. Otherwise it doesn't have any say. And his famous phrase is "Min as-siyasa tark al-siyasa," meaning it's political to leave politics, meaning it's wise to leave politics. And he was so strict that Salafis should stay out of politics because of the corrupting effects. The interesting thing, he has one of his pupils, Abdurrahman Abd Khalik, an Egyptian by origin, but has been based in Kuwait since the 60s. Or at least in the 80s, came out against this thing, while otherwise staying true to a lot of what Albani stood for. He said, he wrote several works about Muslims and political work, and he came to the conclusion that abstaining, not only that it was legitimate to deal with politics, but to abstain from it was to hand victory to the enemies of the faith, which is a very strong statement in quite the opposite direction. And this is the background that in Kuwait and in some other areas in the Gulf, we have seen political participation from the Salafis since the 80s. And if you look at that experience, you can over time you can see exactly this pragmatization of Salafism also. Time is running too fast, but just another struggle, especially centered on Saudi Arabia, it's been the struggle with what's called Madkhali Salafism and Sururi Salafism, where Rabi al-Madkhali was part of the official ulama in Saudi Arabia, and it's not the only one, but one of those who most pronouncedly put forward this thesis of obedience and staying away from politics and obedience to the ruler as a duty of the true Muslim. While Muhammad Surur, originally from Syria, but very influential in Saudi Arabia from the 60s, rather called for action, for activism. It wasn't a question of taking part in politics because that wasn't an option in Saudi Arabia. I mean, there was no parliament thing. But he was a major ideologue for that generation of Saudis who rose and challenged the Saudi kingdom or the monarchy at least the dynasty in the 1990s. Those most activist ones who called for reform in Saudi Arabia at the time and was jailed for that and put down were known as the Sururis. An interesting thing is that both Surur, who was a Syrian, and Abdel Khalik, who I mentioned in the former slide, who was an Egyptian, who both spoke for activism and participation in politics. Both were originally members of the Muslim Brothers. And then they came, both of them actually, to Saudi Arabia and came under influence of Salafism and turned Salafi. But it's interesting that those people that became the basis for a politicized version of Salafism were, in fact, had its origin in the Muslim Brothers. Yeah, briefly, of course, another slide I mentioned that, of course, one Salafi option, you might say, is to enter politics sword in hand. And a prominent example of that was the Jama'ah al-Islamiyah in Egypt, which was a part of the original student movement from the 70s. And this group is interesting because they, it's a different kind of story. It's that when, in the mid-1990s, when they were more or less crushed by the Egyptian security apparatus, the leaders who had actually been in jail since because this group was involved in the assassination of President Sadat in 1981. So most of the leaders had been in jail since then. But in jail, by the mid-90s, they started to discuss and revise and find out that it wasn't very wise what they had done. And in summer of 1997, they came out with an initiative to stop armed struggle. And then in the following years, they published several booklets with a revised their views. It's known in Arabic as a muraja'at, and refuted this jihadi practice and called for peaceful political work. And they tried to get into the political life of Egypt, such as it was under Mubarak, when they were able to start having a website and things like that. But they were ready when the revolution broke to form a political party, which was recognized, the Party of Building and Development. Makes part of this, and they make part of the Salafi coalition. Sure. Yeah. So, just moving to sum up, dissoluble in politics. I mean, can Salafism survive being politicized? Now, I don't have a ready answer to that, but it's a question worth posing. Because I would venture to say that, or it's worth at least no, let me rephrase. I think there is a parallel between the impulse behind Salafism and the original impulse behind the Muslim Brothers when it was created in the 1920s, and also this huge student movement that was created in the 1970s. You know, it is it takes as its starting point, or as one starting point, that is a reaction against what is perceived as moral decay of society, moral dissolution of society, with on the one hand economic change, social change, sort of breaking up or changing social life, such as it were, and bringing bringing new forms of interaction into society, not least between the genders, but also bringing greater distance between rich and poor, and of course through globalization, through a huge influx of Western cultural influence. And there's a reaction against that, and this reaction often, in fact, goes together with a dissatisfaction of the economic and social conditions, and it's many people sort of make the link that this dismal social situation is because of moral decay. And so there's an effort to, and of course corruption enters into this, corruption from at all levels of society enters into this feeling of moral decay. So there's a reaction saying that we need to go back to the true religion. Now, when we talk about the contemporary period, of course, then there is a Muslim Brothers there who have been around since the 1920s, and now the Muslim Brothers have, of course, entered into social and political work for a long, long time, and part of the reason why they have, in a sense, moved a bit in the culture. They are definitely not secularists, but they have moved towards a more flexible attitude towards cultural expression. In clothing, I mean, they would typically wear a suit and a tie, and they wouldn't care so much about the beard, although it goes up, it fluctuates over time, that too. But they would sort of, in the eyes of some, they would become westernized, more like the westernized elite. And so there is and when this happened, at least it did until the revolution in Egypt, for example, the Muslim Brothers changed their ways and their views to become more liberal, more centrist, while the economic and social problems were not solved at all. So and then there was a scope for people who would say that these Muslim Brothers, for a while they were good, but now they have just become like the others, and nothing has become better. So we need to go back to the true religion. So that's I think a basic Salafi impulse. And then but then, and that gives it some of its appeal. But then, when the political landscape, the political opportunities open up with the revolution, and because when sort of this lid of the dictatorship was removed, and people were becoming enthusiastic about changing the conditions in the country, for the Salafis to stand back from that or that's how they saw it, would have a very high price. They would risk becoming marginalized. So they decided to enter into it, and that's I would say, the instability of purist Salafism, or the instability, certainly the moment it enters politics, it becomes very unstable. Because for a while there's a competitive argument. We are more Islamist than those guys, so work for us. We are closer to the poor, which is another argument. They are just middle class. We are closer to the poor. It can work for a while, but very soon there will be, and especially if you have success, there will be the expectation then that you move to do something with these economic conditions. And that's the sort of the price of staying aloof, is to be marginalized in this, certainly in the post-Arab Spring conditions. But the price of staying aloof, price of entering is also high. There is a French expert on Salafism, Stéphane Lacroix, who also was here this spring, I think. I recently heard him speak on this, and he talks about the political Salafis. He divides them into three, what he calls pre-political, political, and populist. This is leaving aside still the jihadis on one side, the Al-Qaeda on one side, and on the other hand, those who have, because some people have stayed out of politics also. But those who enter politics, some are pre-political, and by that he means that they enter politics, but all they care about is prohibiting alcohol and saying that the Sharia should be the basis for laws, and if they had the chance, they would enforce hijab, and they would enforce segregation in the university between men and women. So really not entering politics without entering politics, just coming in with their moral slogans. and then there's a group which we call the political, and then there's which would be in our case, which would be when the salafis move into also discussing the economy and social reform and so on. And then finally what they call the populists, and one version he goes on the revolutionaries. And then he talks about this guy Hazm in the Egyptian case, about Hazm Abu Ismail, who was very early on in the streets in Egypt with the agitation for the revolution, and then later on with the agitation against the military council to topple the military council, and who stayed in the street and tries to build its influence from the street. And that's an interesting way of looking at it, but I would, this I already said, but in the end, there's another version of this paper which I gave you, called the economization of the salafis. Because there is a question that, for those who enter politics, for a populist like Hazm Abu Ismail, he can build his following in the street, but sooner or later he has to translate it into political capital, and now there's already preparations for building, or maybe they already did, at least there's preparation for building a political party to translate it into a capital in the political system, which would bring him back to this position. The pre-political, yes, they can hang around for a while, but also this is in Kuwait for a while, and in a much more conservative society, in a much more affluent society of Kuwait, perhaps it was possible to stay longer just working on those moral issues, but the Salafis these days have certainly become involved in the broad questions of political reform, and also in questions of economic development and so on, because to stay here would over time erode your support. So I end with this question, and then if they stay in well, they might leave, because the realm of pure principles, unadulterated principles, of course has a scope in most societies. People who hold up the principles, but it's much easier to do if you're not in politics, if you're commenting on politics from the sideline. Or otherwise they would probably tend to ikhwanize.